from My Dreaming Soap. Welcome to my channel and thanks for dropping by. I thought it would be time for another technical video. So today we're going to talk about lye. Now lye is something that we have as an essential ingredient when we're making our soap, and it is something that's used in all soap. Now you may hear people say, well, I'm going to make soap without lye. Typically they may be referring to maybe using some melt and pour soap. So I guess technically they are making soap without actually using lye, but there is lye in that soap because with a melt and pour soap, basically the soap is made for you. It's a bit like, imagine if you bought a cake mixture pack. You could say, I'm going to make my cake by taking this cake mixture, tipping it out of the box and stirring in the oils or whatever else is needed, but I'm not using any flour in my cake. Well, you are, because you're using a cake mixture which contains flour. You're just not putting flour in it yourself. The same with a melt and pour soap. The melt and pour soap has just been made by somebody else using the lye in the soap, and then you're just taking this soap and melting it down and colouring it and shaping it. But it still is a soap that has been or has had lye in it to make that soap. So typically, as we said, every actual genuine soap has been made using lye. Now you might see some soaps sold in supermarkets and things that haven't been used in that way. Those are not actual proper soap as we know it. You'll quite often hear them being called something like a beauty bar or something. And those are products that are made using other synthetic ingredients that give you this product that mimics soap. And this is why quite often you'll see them not actually called soap. If, for example, you look at something like Dove, which is a well-known soap as we call it, they call it a Dove beauty bar. Okay, because it's not made in the traditional way. So for genuine cold process soap, we do need to use lye to make it. So what is lye? Well, lye is a chemical. Typically it comes in sort of little white granules or flakes, and there's several different types of lye. Now we're going to go into these different types in a bit more detail later on, but the main types that we'll see are sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, or you can even make lye out of wood. Now let's face it, you're not going to be able to take your piece of wood, pour some oil on it and turn it into soap. Where the wood comes in is, this was the original method of making lye for soap. And what you need to do is take your wood, typically a hardwood, and burn it so you get wood ash. And then it's that wood ash that when it's put through water will actually give you a fairly weak lye solution. And this lye is more along like the potassium lye range rather than sodium, because wood contains quite a lot of potassium. Now I'm not going to go into that process and everything in this video. I do have another video coming up where I'm going to do it, but that's not for this one. So what is lye? Lye is a chemical substance and it's a very strong alkaline. Now you might have heard of acids and alkalines and all that sort of stuff before when we deal with pH ranges. And you may be aware that with your pH ranges you have some things that are very, very acidic. So that would be things like lemon juice, vinegar, those types of things. Some things more neutral, that would be things like water. And then some things like, as we say, our lye, that are incredibly alkaline. And this is where our lye sits, right on the edge of this alkaline scale. In addition to that, lye as you may know, is a very dangerous substance. Lye is incredibly corrosive. It can corrode metals, certain plastics. It can certainly do nasty things like dissolve skin, hair, nails, protein, oils, fats, all of those sort of things. The other reason it's dangerous is because lye is exothermic. Water added to the lye creates an awful lot of heat, that exothermic reaction. And that heat can, of course, burn in a different way. We've got a chemical burn from the actual nature of the lye, and also we can have a heat burn from the exothermic reaction. And because of that, this is why that you'll typically or should see anyone using lye for soap making or whatever they're using it for, making sure that they're wearing proper protective equipment. Now, having said that, lye sounds lovely, doesn't it? And really just the sort of ingredient that you want to include in a product that's made to go all over your body. So therefore, what I'm going to do in this video is explain to you how we use lye and why it's perfectly safe, as long as we use it correctly, in the products that we make. And also we'll have a look at the different types of lye, why they're different to each other, and where you'd use each of these. So come on, let's have a look at that in some more detail.
We use fats, butters and oils when we make our soaps. They're things like olive oil, that sort of thing. Each molecule of an oil is made up of 3 fatty acids bonded to a glycerol molecule, and that's where the name for these come as triglycerides. Each type of oil is slightly different, and that's because they will have different types of fatty acids, but they will all have this basic 3 fatty acid bonded to glycerol structure. To turn our triglyceride into soap, we need to break the bonds between the fatty acids and the glycerol, and our strong alkali, our lye, will do this for us. Having split the triglyceride apart, the lye is broken down, with the sodium part attaching to the fatty acid and the hydrogen part attaching to the glycerol. This will give us some glycerin and 3 soap molecules, and at this point the lye doesn't exist anymore. Let's have a chat about why our potassium hydroxide and our sodium hydroxide are different. We know that they're both strong alkalines, and we know they both do exactly the same thing in our soap. So when we have a look at our sodium and our potassium, the main difference between the two is potassium is bigger. It's bigger and it weighs more. Now this difference has several effects when we use potassium or sodium hydroxide. First of all, it always makes it look like you're using more potassium hydroxide to saponify the same amount of soap. You're not. You're using exactly the same number of bits. It's just that potassium hydroxide is heavier than sodium hydroxide. Here's a recipe printout from Soap Calc. It's a really basic, just single olive oil soap, 1,000 grams of olive oil. And you can see when we make it using potassium hydroxide, we need 190 grams of potassium hydroxide. If we now go and compare that with using sodium hydroxide, we can see that we only need 135 grams of lye. In very sort of simple and general terms, we tend to use sodium hydroxide for solid bar soap and potassium hydroxide for liquid soap. And the reason for that, again, comes down to the difference in size between the two of them. Now, my little diagrams on the screen here are in no way supposed to represent proper chemical diagrams or anything. I'm just trying to give a concept without maybe getting it too confusing. So when we look at the very smallest parts of things like sodium and potassium, each of those will have a nucleus, and the nucleus is kind of like the power of that particle. It's where everything attracts to. Imagine those little black dots almost like a magnet. Now, if you had a magnet inside a smaller shape, can you see how that magnet would hold that smaller shape together better than the magnet inside the bigger shape? All those bits towards the edge of that purple circle aren't going to be held as tightly as the bits in the yellow circle. So what that tells us is that our potassium is weaker. It breaks apart and floats off and whatever a lot easier than our sodium does. And that's why we end up with a liquid soap with potassium and a bar soap with sodium, because the potassium and the sodium are carried through into the final product. So anything that's made with sodium are smaller particle. Those small, tough, strong particles are going to bind together well and have strong bonds between them. And that's what grips our bar soap together. Whereas your potassium hydroxide produces potassium in the soap, and we know it's a little bit weak, it's a little bit flaky. It's much easier to disturb these, and it doesn't take much water, for example, to pull them apart and send them floating around. And this is why we get a liquid soap. What about a dual lye soap? In some cases, we might use a bit of potassium and a bit of sodium hydroxide, and the ratios will differ depending on what it is that you want to do. So, some of the typical things you might do this for are some liquid soaps, but one of the most popular things that this is done for is something like a shave soap. Let's think about why we might want to put some sodium hydroxide into a liquid soap. Now we know we normally use potassium hydroxide in a liquid soap because the potassium hydroxide won't stick together. It floats around and it creates a lovely liquid. But sometimes our liquid soap may be a bit too liquid. You know, we don't want a liquid soap that's like water and the water just runs off. We want to have some structure, some viscosity to it. And you can do that in various ways. You can actually add a thickening agent, but what can be useful is you can add a small amount of sodium hydroxide into your recipe. Now you need to be a little bit careful with this because we mustn't overdo it. What you can't just do is put a load of sodium hydroxide in. Let's ignore the whole lye ratio in oils. Let's pretend we've got all that right. We're not talking about a lye heavy soap. We can't just swap loads of potassium hydroxide out for sodium hydroxide because you're essentially trying to make a bar soap in a liquid. And remember, that sodium hydroxide has very strong bonds. They will be attracted to each other. So therefore, if you just literally make a liquid soap with sodium hydroxide, gosh, I had to get the right one there. What will eventually happen is all the sodium hydroxide, so this sodium, olivate, whatever, all the particles of the soap will actually get drawn together and you'll end up with like a sediment, a gloopy sort of soap and not a nicely dispersed soap. It's sort of the similar thing that happens when sometimes people try and dilute, they grind up and dilute bar soap. It will sort of be fine for a little while, but then it will just go really horrible and slimy and yuck after a while. So yeah, a little bit can help with the viscosity and pulling that solution together a little bit more, but you don't want to go over the top because you're just going to end up with globules and things. No one wants globules, do they? And then let's think about this the other way round, about why we would maybe want to put some potassium hydroxide into a solid soap or something as we see here, like a shave bar. Again, think about what we're trying to do. We're trying to take that solid properties and get a good reaction. So say, for example, with a shaving soap, you want it to foam up really quickly. So therefore, by having a little bit of soap that's much easier to dissolve. It's going to activate a lot quicker. That will give us this very instant, very quick, very voluminous lather that we would like from something like a shave bar. So therefore, having a bit of a combination, we want our shave bar to be a bar, but we want it to react quickly and foam up beautifully with a brush to give a really good shave. Let's now just quickly pop back to soap count, because one thing you may have noticed if you're using it is that there's a third type of lye. So if you look under your potassium hydroxide, can you see this 90% potassium hydroxide? Now, the reason for that is because potassium hydroxide, as we've already seen, is actually quite weak. Sodium hydroxide is nice and strong and it stays together well and it's got good bonds. Potassium hydroxide is a bit flaky, and therefore it degrades really easily anytime it's exposed to any air. It absorbs some of the oxygen and it will also absorb moisture from the air, and that will cause it to degrade. And because it's so easily degraded, it's often not up to full strength. Now, when you buy potassium hydroxide, if you use a reputable supplier, they should give you a certificate of analysis that tells you the strength that they're expecting in the potassium hydroxide, or maybe they just state it on the web page. But one of the most important things to do when you have potassium hydroxide is make sure you don't buy more really than you can use up in a reasonably short period of time. And also just make sure that every time you've used it, that you seal the top really well. I always put mine into a vacuum sealed pack, and I put desiccator packs in mine as well once I've opened a container, and broken that factory seal on it, just to keep it in good condition. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it there for now. We're up to about 20 minutes on a video, so I didn't want to make it too long. Hopefully you found this useful and maybe a slightly different slant than you get normally on soap making videos about lye. I haven't gone into detail about things like lye safety and all of that sort of stuff, because there's loads of videos on lye and soap making and soap safety out there. So if that's what you're after, then obviously do make sure that you go and have a look at those. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, it would be great if you gave me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see what I'm making in the future, why not subscribe to my channel? Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy soaping.